Hello and welcome to The Print. I'm Zoya, and in our Great Speeches series, we explore a landmark address by P.N. Haksar from 1974. As Indira Gandhi's principal secretary and one of India's most influential foreign policy architects, Haksar delivered this Sardar Patel Memorial Lecture at a pivotal moment in global affairs. The Cold War was at its height. Superpowers were getting closer, and India's non-alignment policy faced constant criticism. Why revisit this speech now? With today's multipolar world and debates about strategic autonomy, Haksar's insights about sovereignty, power, and national interest remain extremely relevant. Haksar began with what he called an obvious point, but one that needed stating. In an era when European nations were moving toward integration and multinational corporations were crossing borders with ease, many intellectuals questioned the relevance of sovereignty. Haksar had encountered this attitude firsthand at international conferences, where academics argued that sovereign nation-states were obsolete. Responding to a distinguished professor who claimed God didn't create sovereign states, Haksar delivered a sharp retort. He said, and I quote, "If God did not create sovereign states, nor did God create a market economy or a consumer-oriented economy, let's abolish both." And I also gave him an assurance on behalf of India that the minute he sends me a telegram that the sovereign state of France, Germany, Britain, United States abolished, India will abolish the sovereign state of India. End quote. For newly independent nations like India, sovereignty remained their primary protection against exploitation. He said, "For the poor countries of the world, there is only one shield, namely safeguarding their sovereignty and their independence." End quote. While many focused on military hardware and missile counts, Haksar argued that true diplomatic strength came from something deeper. He was addressing an audience fascinated by outer indices of power, the visible symbols of military might that often mesmerized Indian strategic thinkers. He said, "More than guns and missiles, the ultimate sanction behind any foreign policy is, above all, the unity and the cohesiveness of a social structure into which that foreign policy is rooted." End quote. Haksar then addressed a fundamental shift in how foreign policy operated in the modern world. The era of aristocratic diplomats conducting secret negotiations was over, replaced by an age where public opinion and media scrutiny shaped international relations. Even Henry Kissinger had acknowledged this dilemma. Haksar, quoting Kissinger, said, "What is the future of democracy when the propagandist side of policies becomes more and more separated from the substantive side?" End quote. The intrusion of the common man into foreign policy was irreversible, and any diplomatic strategy that ignored this reality was doomed to fail. This brought Haksar to the defense of Nehru's foreign policy, often dismissed as naive idealism. Haksar argued that Nehru had actually been the most realistic statesman of his era, grasping the implications of nuclear weapons better than his contemporaries, who remained trapped in pre-atomic thinking. The traditional balance of power system had worked when it could ultimately resort to war as the final arbiter. But the nuclear age had fundamentally changed this calculus. He said, "Balance of power without a capacity to inflict war as an instrument for enforcing that balance of power is, by process of reductio ad absurdum, an exercise in futility." And that is why Mr. Nehru, more than anybody else, more than any other statesman of the world, whose eyes were bloodshot by the Cold War, saw more clearly and fully the nature of the world which has now emerged, of which the symbol is the nuclear weapon. End quote. Haksar then addressed one of the most significant vindications of India's non-aligned approach, the Sino-Soviet split. Critics had long argued that India should choose sides in the Cold War, accepting the premise that the world was divided between monolithic blocs. But Nehru had rejected this framework as early as 1927, when he analyzed the Chinese Revolution. Haksar said, "However, all this does not mean that the Chinese Republic will be fashioned wholly on the lines laid down by Marx. Even Soviet Russia has had to give up part of its communism, and in China, where the small peasant is the deciding factor, the departure from pure communism will be the greater." End quote. Haksar then provided a case study of how India's foreign policy principles had been tested during the 1971 Bangladesh crisis. When millions of refugees poured across the border, public opinion demanded immediate action. But Haksar's team recognized that hasty recognition of the Mukti Bahini government would play into Pakistan's narrative of Indian interference. He said, "We had to pay a price in waiting patiently to convince the world at large that the Bangladesh movement was legitimate, without which neither the Soviet Union nor Britain and France would have accepted that the struggle in Bangladesh is a genuine struggle of the people there." End quote. The principle Haksar drew from this experience was crucial. He said, "In the realm of international affairs, feelings are important, but facts must be subordinated to feelings." End quote. Addressing India's troubled relationship with China, Haksar identified the real issue, not border disputes, but the fundamental question of strategic autonomy. He said, "The question is, must country A tell us who should our friends be? Why should we give up friendship with Soviet Union for earning the friendship of China, any more than we would say to Soviet Union that in order to be friends with us, you should give us friendship with country A, B or C?" End quote. In his conclusion, Haksar addressed perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of India's foreign policy. Non-alignment was never an end in itself, but a means to achieve India's fundamental objectives. He said, "Non-alignment was never a foreign policy of India. The foreign policy of India was to safeguard, promote, protect its interests and above all, its independence. Non-alignment was merely a means and method of achieving certain foreign policy aims at a particular time and a particular place." End quote. The goal wasn't to avoid taking sides, but to avoid being forced into choices that didn't serve India's interests. P.N. Haksar's 1974 lecture stands as one of the most sophisticated defenses of India's foreign policy approach. As India navigates a multipolar world and pressure to choose sides in new Cold Wars, Haksar's voice reminds us that true realism lies not in bending to others' frameworks, but in pursuing one's own interests while contributing to global stability. Thank you for joining us on Great Speeches. For more from The Print, become a subscriber at theprint.in/subscribe. I'm Zoya in Delhi. Tune in every day for more such news and analysis.